Hey, it's Ben from ZOAR Fitness, and today we're talking about the upper body action on the assault bike. And what I found with most people is that they tend to focus on the physiology side of things, so like improving the biology in those systems, so like the way that the heart can deliver blood and the way that you can actually exchange gas with your respiratory muscles and your oxidative capacity of your muscles, but not necessarily the actual technique of how you're powering the bike so that you can be the most efficient as possible, and that the actual physiology that you currently have you can express better with a more efficient power output on the bike. So let's head over to the bike and we'll talk about some upper body action. Alright, so now that I'm actually on the bike, again, we're not talking about how we're driving our physiology and really trying to get better training adaptations. The goal is for us to use the physiology, the fitness that we already have, and to get the best output possible by using this the most efficient way that we can. So again, today we're talking about the upper body action, so the handles of the bike. How can we transfer our power effectively to the handles? So first thing that we have to realize about the bike is that when we're manipulating the handles, the handles actually are manipulating a bar, which is manipulating the pedal. All right? So this is the first thing that we have to understand, is that this horizontal bar that's going across is what's manipulating this pedal. So at different points in the stroke, it's going to be more or less efficient at actually transferring that power. So you'll notice as we get to the end ranges, and if we try to stop right there, and then we try to generate power from there, it's really awkward and it takes some time until it gets past that sticky point. And then once they get kind of past each other in the middle, that's when that power transfer happens really effectively. So a little analogy to help you out with this. If we take something like this is exactly what that looks like, right? Where we have basically a horizontal bar that's manipulating a circle, right? This is exactly what's happening with that. So if we come in at end range when it's right in the middle here, I can push really hard and it doesn't want to spin, and then all of a sudden it spins really easy once my hand gets up to the top. So where we want to be putting in the power is as it comes past the middle, as we get up towards the top, it spins really easily there, versus when I come to the middle, it's really inefficient. I can put a lot of power in and it's not gonna actually make that spin any easier. So again, that's the goal here, is for us to take this and actually have it spin easier. So again, if we're at end ranges like we're at now, it's gonna be much harder to get that up to speed, versus if I was right in the middle, it's much easier for me to get that going, right? So again, that's the first thing we have to realize, is that we want to put most of the power in as the handles are coming past each other, rather than when they're at the end ranges. So the end ranges are a relatively inefficient place to put in a lot of power, and you want to think about putting as much power in as the handles come past each other in that handle stroke. So it's also really important for us to remember that, yes, we're talking about manipulating the handles today, but most of the power from the bike is going to be generated from your legs. So we want to optimize our position on the bike for the legs, and then again, wherever we're at in terms of seat height, in terms of seat slide forward and back, and then we'll just make up whatever ground we have to by leaning with the upper body, so that we can get relatively close to end range with the elbow in that position. So again, we should be able to get a pretty decent power position from our arms just by the amount of torso lean that we're incorporating. But it's first most important that we optimize for the legs. I've already done a video on the bike setup, how to maximize your power in the actual setup of the bike and where you're putting the seat in terms of seat height and slide, because that's the only things you can actually manipulate on the bike. So I'll link to that. Certainly check that out first if you haven't yet. But this is more a secondary thing that we want to focusing on, but it certainly does matter, right? The other thing we have to realize is that with the only two things that you can manipulate being seat height and seat slide, is that depending on how tall or short you are, it's really going to change how these handles are actually oriented towards your body. So if we have someone who's really short, say I'm like a 5-foot female, it's going to be all the way down here at the bottom. And when I get on the bike, these handles are all the way up, like almost at my shoulder level. So when I'm when I'm manipulating the handles, this is way up here, almost like I'm in like a bench press position, in like a row position, where it's very horizontal. All the action is really horizontal, and ideally we're keeping the elbows relatively tucked as we're manipulating the handles. but it's really difficult to do that when the handles are up so high on your body. So in nature, you have to have your elbows out just a little bit if you're someone who's really short. Versus if you're someone who's, I don't know, like maybe a 6'5" male, and you're all the way here at the top, and you get on, now all of a sudden the handles are way up, or sorry, the seat's way up, so the handles are down really low, and all the action is happening actually below your torso. So now, rather than it being up here, everything's down here. So now, again, if I want to press, it's really awkward because I can't get my elbow vertical at all, or horizontal at all, to be able to press. So everything's a very vertical action. So what happens is we get in the shoulder position where it's like you want to press, but you have to kind of lead with that shoulder. That's where that really inefficient pressing position comes from, where it's much more efficient to be able to pull with this straight arm like this and kind of rip on the bike that direction. So for a lot of people who are shorter, they end up doing a lot more pressing on the handles. And if someone's really tall, they end up doing a lot more straight arm pulling on the bike. The one thing they have to be careful with, if you're someone who is really tall, is that if I'm pulling on the bike, that's basically encouraging my hips to slide forward on the bike. And as soon as my hips slide forward, then as I come around the top, my hips go forward. That means my knees are going forward. That means much more of the action's happening at the quad or at the knee, and then it just blows up my quads. So I have to think about actively kind of pushing myself back into the seat as well if I'm up, someone who's up that high. All right, so say you're someone who's not an extreme height, so maybe a 5'3" female to a 6'1" male, somewhere in that range, where the way that you are powering the bike is going to have, a relatively middle of the bell curve. The way that you can actually power it is pretty normal, let's say. So there's going to be 3 ways that you can actually put power into the bike. You can pedal, you can push, and you can pull. Right? So those are the 3 ways that you can actually put power into the bike. If you're sprinting, obviously you're going to take advantage of all 3 of those power pathways and generate as much power, as much tension, as much force as you can in a very short duration window. That's the whole idea of a sprint. So as we're pushing and pulling, one of the things we have to understand is as we're doing this upper body action where I'm pushing and pulling, it's a rotational force. I'm generating all this rotation, and I actually have to occlude my breathing. I stop breathing for just a period of time as I'm generating all this power, and my respiratory muscles are going to be in conflict between kind of generating all these rotational forces and also exchanging gas. So they have to do 2 different roles here. So if I'm someone who's at a more sustainable wattage and I'm still ripping on those handles, pushing and pulling in both directions, that's going to be inefficient. Like, you just can't really sustain that because your breathing demands are so much higher at that point, especially if you're someone who's already has a respiratory limiter. It's just going to aggravate that and make it way worse. So this is what I'm calling tridirectional power output versus bidirectional power output. So if I'm sprinting, I'm going to take, again, advantage of all 3 of those power pathways where I pedal, I pull, I push, I use all 3. It's tridirectional power. Once I go down to sustainable wattages where it's going to be something where maybe I'm doing it for 20, 30, 40 minutes, hours at a time, that I'm really going to make sure that I'm focusing on being as sustainable as possible, and I'm really going to remove most of the pulling action. Maybe not entirely, but I'm really going to think about trying to mainly press on the handles as I'm pedaling the bike, right? So what I like to do is actually release my grip just a little bit, make it a little looser, and that way I can actually, again, mainly making sure that I'm staying upright and maintaining that good torso angle rather than really trying to rip and generating a lot of rotational forces that just make it really challenging on my respiratory musculature. So again, that's reasons why we would use, again, pedal, push, pull versus just pedal and push. Obviously this is gonna be like a spectrum, right? Like, it's not like sprint and sustain or always it's either one or the other. Like there can be places where there's a blend. So realize that the pulling especially, you start out, say it's a very easy wattage, the pulling is going to be relatively low, pushing is going to have some input, and it's going to be mainly pedaling. But, so say this is pushing where it's kind of a linear line, the amount of pulling you're doing at a very sustainable wattage is going to be relatively little, and then as we go up to a sprint wattage, it's going to be sort of an exponential curve of your pulling. We're going to pull so much harder when you're actually doing a sprint, more so than you're actually pushing. So the pulling actually becomes a bigger input towards the high end of those spectrums. So just realize that the way you're powering the bike and actually manipulating the handles and the way that we're pulling and pushing
And pedaling is going to change ideally based on what wattages we're at, if it's more sprinty and powerful versus sustainable and more endurance work. So that's really the biggest thing that we have to pay attention to in terms of being sustainable and efficient in terms of the handle input on the bike.
Thanks for watching. As always, if you have any questions, let us know, and head over to ZOARfitness.com for training related resources and one-on-one coaching for the sport of fitness.